To make sure that we understand and manage vulnerabilities, we have to think of it as a pair. There must be both a threat and related vulnerability for there to be a risk. So when we look at this overall setup, let's look at the first part. The threat could be an ex-employee. The vulnerability is an employee who still has access to the system. The threat actions, they access proprietary data or data that really shouldn't be because they're no longer part of the company. But notice you really need to have these two paired up in order to frankly have a threat action. Now, by the way, that's just one threat. There could be multiple vulnerabilities with this. Here we're just talking about access to the system. Well, maybe it's still access to the building. Maybe it's access to the computer systems. So you can use a threat and have multiple vulnerabilities and still have multiple threat actions. But again, it's got to be a pair between the two. So when we're managing a vulnerability, you should attempt to pair it with one or more threats like I just talked about. Now, where does mitigation come into this is frankly, well, in two aspects. You really want to try to mitigate any type of vulnerability before it gets to a loss, okay? But then we have to check the mitigation if we do have a loss. How do we mitigate that type of loss? So mitigation also means how do we fix it or reduce the impact. That's mitigation when it comes to, well, the overall topic that we're talking about here. So notice mitigation really is going to have two aspects to this. Before it should happen, or shouldn't happen, let's put it that way, we need to check the vulnerabilities. And then if it does happen, well, what do we need to recuperate from that? Here is a chart that's trying to keep this easy. And again, this should be part of your overall plan once we start writing this up. We have our threat source, we have our vulnerability, and then what could end up happening, and then how do we do the mitigation for this? Now, to be honest with you, yeah, I'm doing this intentionally. The orange part isn't going to happen first. You really need to spell out what the threat source could be, then the vulnerability, and then what could happen if things don't, well, frankly, aren't mitigated, okay? So that's three steps really that I'm showing here, trying to block as much as I can here, okay? Then we talk about the mitigation. How can we do that? Now, the mitigation, by the way, again, comes in two aspects. How do we do it before the vulnerability, it really becomes a problem? And then how do we mitigate after it has become a problem? Now, by the way, you'll also notice that in threat source, I just have one for each one here. To be honest with you, users, weak passwords, users have other issues. So I can use users for quite a bit of threats and add different vulnerabilities to them. So I don't want you to think this is a very simple table, but at least tries to get you in the thought process of building something like this, because what we come up with mitigation and what we come up with our threat action helps us reduce the threat by creating policies, by creating active controls, access controls. You know, these are all things that we need to think about. This is going to help us devise a plan to make sure that we reduce those risks.